begging the government to reinforce the flood defences, but they didn't. We went and spoke to everyone from the local authorities to the national government, and still nothing.
The worst floods for 100 years in Sudan completely destroyed most homes in this neighborhood. The government has defended its response so far, saying that it's been hindered by international economic sanctions, as well as the sharp fall in the Sudanese pound.
Our house was the first one to be flooded in the neighborhood. We were asleep. We could only save our lives. Everything we owned got swept away.
Sudan's rapid deployment forces have sprayed insecticides on pools of stagnant water to kill mosquito larvae. But given how widespread the flooding has been, it's almost impossible for everywhere to be disinfected. The destruction of thousands of pit latrines by the floods poses a grave danger to the population. UN agencies like UNICEF are now helping the government run emergency health centers to deal with any outbreaks. At one of the numerous camps for the displaced in Sinja, UNICEF medical staff are immunizing children against measles and other communicable diseases. The healthcare workers say they're doing everything they can to avoid outbreaks.
Scaling up our nutrition surveillance. Now we are conducting more screening to be on standby for any nutrition outbreak, and also to detect early the malnutrition case and to treat them and to refer them if they need further treatment.
The government in recent days issued new alerts to communities living on the banks of the Nile that rains in the highlands of neighboring Ethiopia could lead to flash floods. Sudan's Humanitarian Aid Commission says 650,000 people have been affected since the start of the rains in mid-July. Millions of others are facing hardship as the cost of food and transport soars because of the flood disaster and long-running economic turmoil in Sudan. Mohamed Adu, Al Jazeera, Sinja in southwestern Sudan.
Now, an animal hunted to near extinction in England 400 years ago is making a comeback. Beavers are thriving in the county of Devon, and as Charlie Angela discovered, they're attracting tourists as well as improving water quality and reducing the risk of flooding.
A family of beavers frolicking on the River Otter. Hunted to extinction in the 17th century for their fur and their meat, Eurasian beavers were discovered here 12 years ago. No one knows where they came from, but when the government threatened to remove them, fearing they could carry disease, there was local outcry. The beavers were allowed to stay for 5 years, as long as they were closely studied. Scientists say the benefits they bring are obvious.
There's a whole long list, but 4 main ones are flood reduction, so when they build dams, they reduce flooding downstream. Water quality improvements, those same dams capture pollutants. We see carbon capture within the dams in the vegetation that grows and the sediments behind them. And then we see an explosion in the wildlife, so much more wetland wildlife moving in after the beavers have colonised.
15 families now live here, and the government has sanctioned their reintroduction across the country. It's a groundbreaking decision, returning a once extinct native species to England, but not without problems. Beavers are brilliant architects, cutting down trees to build dams which create deep pools of water to hide in and store their plant food.
You can see here 3 pools created entirely by beaver dams. It's a welcome change to this landscape, but some landowners are concerned that similar dams could flood their fields. Conservationists are urging the government to provide funds so that everyone can embrace their return.
Flooding and managing it is already costing the UK $2.8 billion a year. Ecologists are keen to point out that the work the beavers do has real value, far outweighing the costs of minor floods to farmland.
These beaver dams store water. They can slow the flow of water through catchments, which can alleviate flooding and create more flood-resilient landscapes. The beavers slow water down as it moves through their territory, and that has the impact on sediment dropping out of the water, and that can trap environmental pollution such as phosphate and nitrates. So a really useful species to reintroduce in England.
Back on the river as their numbers grow, so has interest in them, attracting tourists and boosting the local economy. This female has 4 offspring who will each go out to find their own river to build lodges and dams on, spreading the benefits across the country. Charlie Angela, Al Jazeera, Southwest England.
All the news, of course, on our website. There it is on your screen, the address aljazeera.com. Time for a quick check of the headlines here on Al Jazeera. The US has broken with all other permanent members of the UN Security Council and declared so-called snapback sanctions on Iran. America's major allies, Britain, France, Germany, had already written to the UN to say sanctions relief will remain. The dispute is over the Iran nuclear deal, which Washington pulled out of 2 years ago. Protesters in Thailand have placed a symbolic plaque next to the Grand Palace in the capital, Bangkok, outlining their demands for a reform of the political system and the monarchy. Tens of thousands of demonstrators are once again out on the streets. US President Donald Trump says he could announce a nominee to replace Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg as early as next week. Ginsburg died on Friday. Her death comes just weeks before the US presidential election.
I will be putting forth a nominee next week. It will be a woman. It will be a woman. Would you rather have a woman on the Supreme Court? Yes, woman, yes. Tom Tillis says yes. So would you rather have a woman, or would you rather have a man on the Supreme Court?
Well, at least 2 Republican senators have joined the Democrats in rejecting a vote on Ginsburg's replacement before the election. That's the position Republicans took in 2016 under Barack Obama, when he nominated his candidate for Supreme Court. And Donald Trump says he will approve a deal to allow the social media app TikTok to keep operating in the US. He said an agreement with the tech firm Oracle and supermarket chain Walmart to take over the American operations of the Chinese-owned app would get his blessing. The White House had applied pressure on the company over what it called national security concerns. And Sudan's government's being urged to do more to prevent damage and loss of life from heavy flooding. 500,000 people have been forced from their homes and more than 100 have died. There are warnings of more flash floods as authorities work to stop disease spreading in affected villages. So, those were the headlines. The news continues here on Al Jazeera after the Listening Post. Stay tuned. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.
I joined Al Jazeera as part of the launch team in 2006.
Protesters have called for a 1 million-man march.
In that time, I've covered wars, revolutions, elections and military coups. From the favelas of Caracas to the battlefields around Mosul, our job is to get to the truth and empower people through knowledge.
Surprise announcement from the Oval Office of a peace deal between Bahrain and Israel.
President Trump announced it just weeks after the United Arab Emirates took the same step.
Some praise it for promoting peace, and others call it electioneering for Trump and Netanyahu.
Hello, I'm Meenakshi Ravi, sitting in for Richard Gisbert, and you're watching The Listening Post, working from home. Here are the media stories we're covering this week. The Abraham Accords. Behind all the talk about peace between Israel and the Gulf states, there is a lot of posturing and even more PR. In the United States, an affiliate of the Al Jazeera network, AJ+, is ordered to register as a foreign agent. They've reported on mounting crises, a chronically corrupt government, a collapsing state. And then came the blast. What's it like to be a journalist in Lebanon today? And a Saudi musician teams up with an Israeli one to create one of the many meme-worthy videos that have come in the wake of the Abraham Accords.
1, 2, 3, go!
The talk in the Middle East these days is of normalization between Gulf states and Israel. Just this past week, the United Arab Emirates and the Kingdom of Bahrain formally signed what was being sold as historic peace deals with Israel. What these deals do is make official an open secret that for years there's been a growing alliance between certain Arab Gulf states and Israel, an alliance that has bypassed the issue of the occupation of Palestine altogether. Normalization is a charged topic in the Arab world. Rulers know that by pursuing it, they risk the anger of a disapproving public, which is why the media push, in news discussions, on Twitter, even in TV dramas, to normalize normalization started before the deals were signed and are likely to go on for a while beyond, especially since there are further deals on the horizon. Our starting point this week is where the deals were signed, Washington, D.C.
Bahrain will fully normalize its diplomatic relations with Israel. This is a truly historic day.
It was a signing ceremony laden with symbolism and spin. The three countries, Israel, the UAE and Bahrain, committing to peace, have never been at war. Any sticking point in their relationship prior to this had been over Israel's occupation of Palestine. But there were no Palestinian representatives at this event.
This day is a pivot of history. It heralds a new dawn of peace.
What was unfolding in Washington, D.C., in front of cameras from around the world, was a triumph of political strategizing and messaging. A normalization of regional relations that doesn't meaningfully address the schisms and injustices faced by people living in the region.
The way that the UAE deal was sold, they actually tried to sell it as being something good for the Palestinians. And so they did this whole show of this being about stopping the annexation of the West Bank and how they were actually supporting the Palestinian people.
دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة مع الشعب الفلسطيني داعم مستمر، واعتقد الرسالة كانت واضحة يعني من بداية الإعلان عن المعاهدة.
Even now, with the ongoing trend of trying to shift the discourse around Palestine and around normalization, they know they still need to sell it as something that's good for the Palestinian people.
They're trying to confuse the question here from being one of occupation to being one of interfaith.
They are part of this land. They are part of our region. The Jewish people belong here.
This is the part which goes out on TV shows and sermons and stuff. They're trying to make the acceptance of Israel a matter of tolerance. Let's tolerate Jews, which of course we have no problem with. It's not our problem has never been with Jews as being Jews. Our problem is with the colonization of Palestine.
To most Israelis, the relationships they have or haven't got with Israel has not been a major political debate. But ever since Gulf officials started publishing op-eds and videos in the local media in Israel, the whole question of the relationship between Israel and the Gulf states surfaced. Many of the stories about the Gulf states over the past couple of months have focused on the hotels in the Gulf states and how Israeli tourism could enjoy the exciting attractions in the Gulf states. The Palestinian question was sidelined almost entirely.
For all the players in this field, the Arab countries, UAE and Bahrain, Israel and the United States, which has claimed the role of peace broker, the deals are a response to the pressures of realpolitik, an assortment of strategic and political concerns that have trumped what was once the Arab consensus that normalization with Israel would be contingent on the creation of an independent Palestinian state.
I think what has happened with the UAE and Bahrain is that now normalization is front-loaded and anything to do with the occupation comes afterwards. They have different sets of reasons. Bahrain is focused on one thing and one thing only, Iran. Bahrain regards Iran as an existential threat. With the UAE, there's Iran. In addition, there's the whole matter of the UAE seeking to become a tech hub. And who would they partner with in the region? There's only one country that is operating technology in the same similar way, and that's Israel.
Clearly, Israel has an interest in developing some kind of economic, financial relations with the Gulf states and perhaps collaborations fighting Iran. But mostly Netanyahu had a clear interest in distracting the public opinion in Israel from his own upcoming corruption trial. And together with the COVID crisis, which is now skyrocketing in Israel, for him to bring a national achievement is very important. And clearly for Trump too, this is a good distraction from COVID and an important achievement before the elections.
The fanfare across much of the Arab media has been designed to cover all the bases. There are the newspapers, such as the UAE's Khalij Times, which ran a cover page greeting Arab and supposedly new Israeli readers. In the days following the UAE deal, religious broadcasters in the Gulf delivered sermons on TV and online, emphasizing the duty of Muslims to trust in the decisions made by their leaders.
الحكمة هو تحقيق منافع المسلمين ودفع المفاسد عن المسلمين ويرجع إلى ولي الأمر.
The TV messaging extended beyond the Gulf. 3 channels, Dubai TV, Bahrain TV, and the Israeli channel 12, hosted a simultaneous live broadcast to mark the signing of the deals.
أهلا محمد الشلام يونت.
Online, however, is where the stakes in the messaging battle have been the highest, and Twitter is ground zero. When the UAE deal was announced, there were waves of effusive Emirati tweets. The notion that it was all sincere and spontaneous was shattered by another set of tweets from pro-government verified accounts asking that the UAE's security services monitor Twitter for messages critical of the deal and punish those people.
Keep in mind that a lot of the accounts that you see are basically, they're not voices. We should not call them voices because they don't have their own voice. These are nodes in a government-operated, government-funded disinformation network. The fact is that since 2011, Twitter went from being the parliament of the Arabs and the most important Arabic-speaking public sphere to being an engine and a tool of repression for these dictatorships. They created kind of an alternative reality there because you don't know what the Saudi people actually think. You don't know what the Emirati people actually think because they are unable to speak.
On the other hand, in Bahrain, it was quite the opposite. Twitter became the platform for people to come out and say, we actually stand against this. This does not represent the Bahraini people. In Bahrain, you have more of a history of people protesting, especially when it comes to Palestine. And that's why there's also this difference between the reaction that we've been seeing in the United Arab Emirates versus the reaction that we have been seeing in Bahrain since the normalization.
The engagement between Arab countries and Israel has been a reality for years. Israel leads certainly the region, if not the world, in spyware and surveillance technology. And it has found willing and eager customers across the Middle East.
The Saudis kind of started purchasing hacking tools and surveillance technology from the Israelis in 2017, but by all indications is that the Emiratis had access to these long before that. Of course, the selling point of this technology is it is kind of a surveillance superweapon. So, you know, if you're an Emirati or if you live in the UAE and they have this software, it's almost a foregone conclusion that they will be able to get into your phone. Not only is Israel providing hacking technology to these governments, it's also offering its own intelligence analysts to help them make sense out of the megabytes and gigabytes of stolen data. So this goes back to the point that this is more than simply a normalization agreement. This is a full-on alliance. Israel is offering these governments everything that they need for them to quiet internal dissent, to target dissidents, target journalists, target human rights activists. In return, these governments, of course, are giving this gift of normalization and diplomatic victories to the Netanyahu government and to the Trump government.
The deals with the UAE and Bahrain mark a new phase of normalization between Israel and countries in the Middle East. Oman and Sudan are rumored to be signing up next. There are some countries, however, for which the red line with Israel is non-negotiable. Kuwait, for instance. A couple of years ago, you would be excused for thinking Saudi Arabia would also not consider formalizing its relations with Israel. It looks like that road isn't completely closed anymore.
There is a sense in which most Saudi commentators and reporters are keeping the space open for Saudi Arabia to maybe do it. They're not thundering against it. Any Saudi who reads between the lines would realize that their country is being helpful to Bahrain and especially to the UAE. And so that means that Saudi Arabia is not closed to this by any means.
History was made at the White House today. Israel, the UAE.
Normalization has taken up a lot of airtime. The celebration of the deals done, the anticipation of the deals to come, and the speculation of what Saudi Arabia might or might not do. For all the talk of peace, though, the notion of a breakthrough in the region, the people who have been awaiting peace and a resolution, the Palestinians, they remain unconsulted and unheard from. The other media story we're looking at this week relates to this network, Al Jazeera. specifically a social media affiliate of Al Jazeera based in the United States, AJ+. This past week, AJ+ was told by the US Justice Department to formally register as a foreign agent in the country. One of our producers, Nick Muirhead, has been looking into this. Nick, can you start by explaining how has this move been justified and what does it mean for AJ+?
As you know, Mina, the AJ+ is funded by the state of Qatar, so the US Department of Justice says that it therefore must be under the direction and control of the government there. It's using a law called the Foreign Agent Registration Act, FARA, to make AJ+ register as a foreign agent. Al Jazeera released a statement saying, "We are deeply disappointed by the department's decision, which runs counter to the extensive factual record we provided demonstrating that FARA registration is not applicable to AJ+. The legal structure, editorial policies, budgeting process, and content of AJ+ demonstrates its independence." What does this registration mean for AJ+? Well, for news organizations that this has happened to in the past, they've seen their staff numbers capped. Employees who aren't US citizens have been denied working visas, they've been denied press accreditation. So it really can be a hindrance for a news organization.
So there are other foreign media outlets against which FARA has been used. Can you tell us a bit about that?
So it's mostly being invoked by the Trump administration, starting in 2017 with RT, which is the Russian-owned news organization. Then in 2019, China's CGTN. Earlier this year, TRT, which is owned by Turkey, had to register under FARA, and now AJ+. The DOJ says that all of these channels are engaged in what it calls political activities for their respective governments.
So it would seem as though the Trump government is targeting foreign media outlets, or at least some foreign media outlets, because the BBC, Germany's Deutsche Welle, Canada's CBC, amongst many other foreign media outlets, they're all working in the United States without this designation, right?
That's right. It does look like this law is being applied selectively. But in the case of AJ+, there is a bit of a backstory, and it has to do with some recent political history in the Gulf. In 2017, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt all severed ties with Qatar. The differences are largely to do with regional geopolitics, but one of their major gripes was with Qatar's funding of Al Jazeera and how the network covers the region. In fact, they even demanded that the entire network be shut down, which clearly didn't happen. But it's been widely documented that the UAE has been aggressively lobbying in Washington for US members of Congress to force Al Jazeera outlets based in the US to register under FARA. Why AJ+ has been targeted is unclear.
Okay, Nick, so this looks like a story that will develop a bit, so we'll keep our eye on it. One of the fundamentals of journalism is objectivity, to be able to take an unsentimental approach, to never get too close to a story. But there are times and places where journalistic detachment is a luxury. What's it like to report on a crisis when you're living right in the middle of it? That's the situation facing journalists today in Lebanon. Just over a month ago, an explosion of nearly 3,000 tons of ammonium nitrate stored